I'm here with Pauline Oliveros. She's a renowned teacher, composer, and musician. In this segment, we'll be talking about her own spiritual journey. Welcome, Pauline.
Thank you.
So we should talk about your spiritual path. So how did you get started with the deep listening? And how does it, as a spiritual practice, not as a musical practice?
Well, I think that if you are receptive to others and building community through practice, through whatever it is that you do, that is spiritual. You know, I don't come from a religious background. My family consisted of fallen Catholics. Meaning that the Catholics that didn't practice anymore.
That's right. Did they at least go to church on Christmas and Easter? No.
Well, that yes, but
maybe.
But church going was not something that I did maybe for a couple of years when my mother thought we ought to get baptized or something, but. My mother's parents, my grandparents, my grandfather was still deciding what kind of religion he was interested in. My grandmother had been brought up in a convent boarding school, so she was a Catholic, and she did now and then go to church, but my grandparents would, Sunday morning would come around and one of them would say, well, should we go to church? And the other one would say, well, I don't know. And then they wouldn't go.
It's raining, it's snowing.
But my mother was an only child, and she she went to Catholic school for a time anyways, but her stories about that were not so wonderful. And she was probably in a state of some confusion because of the difference between my grandfather and grandmother in terms of their religious understanding. My grandfather loved to go to different churches, to different places. He wanted to experience all the different religions.
Yeah, me too.
And but as a consequence, the only thing that I experienced was a couple of years of Episcopalian church, and it was kind of fascinating, but it didn't. That was not something that I continued to do. So I grew up without a church or religious background, really. I think the spirituality that I came through my mother, and was a experience I had as a little kid that I think has guided me quite strongly all my life, which my mother loved to give birthday parties for me, and so this birthday party, I must have been 5 or 6 years old, and it was in the park, and you know, there were a number of children came, and one of our friendly mothers was there helping and with playing games and various things, and then there was this little girl that showed up, and she was a stray, so to speak, a little bit bedraggled, and she wanted to join the party, and I was resistant to that. I thought, whoa, you know, who are you? What's this? And my mother came right up and invited her right into the party, and she had a fantastic time, you know, and that taught me something very special about, you know, welcoming and being generous in certain ways. And so I always remember that, you know. And I remember my mother saying, talking about what a good time that little girl had, you know.
Right.
So, and she was always very generous in that way. So that was my spiritual practice developed out of that incident, that experience, I think.
Yeah. And so then all these years later, you went on to discover deep listening on your own, because that was never introduced to you as a spiritual practice. But then somehow it evolved from a musical practice, from a composer's, musician's
Well,
background.
it's still that.
It's still that.
Yes, of course.
But it's more than that.
It may be more than that, but that's up to whoever is participating. It's up to them.
And what about you? Is it for you?
For me, I practice, you know, and my feeling is that if I'm listening, then it helps others to listen. If I'm not listening, I can tell the difference, so to speak. But I have been able to go into various situations and just listen to it and have it change. And there was an incident recently. I was at an artist residency, and one of the composers there was overwhelmed in a certain way and just had a meltdown. And she was, people were trying to talk to her and get her through it. And I went and I sat down by her and said, "Let's just listen," you know. And pretty soon she was okay. It's because she didn't really need people telling her anything.
Right.
She really just needed to come to center. So those kinds of things can happen.
And so do you feel like with this deep listening, that's what you're doing, is you're really just coming to center?
Well, if we know what that is, maybe, I mean, the term is used often about centering, and what does that mean, really? I guess if you find your own center or of your own being and connect with it, that you feel balanced, and that certain things are not necessary. I mean, just simply be and just experience the world as it is. That to me is what it is what centering must mean.
So you were raised not with a little bit of Christian background, and you went on, and now you're practicing deep listening. Do you have any other spiritual practices that you do?
No.
Have you studied in any other tradition?
Yeah, I've studied a bit of Buddhism, but I would, if I had to say I was something, I would say that. But I'm not going to religious ceremonies or communities necessarily. I guess I feel that doing the work that I'm doing is
the
enough.
Deep listening.
Yeah.
I mean, I believe that with the deep listening, there's other traditions that practice that. So actually, when I told you that story about how I was on retreat and I kept listening and hearing the sounds behind the sounds, and I was thinking of you, and I ended up stumbling across some writing by a monk from the Thai forest tradition, Ajahn Sumedho, and he had been teaching a very similar practice. And he thought he just made it up, I mean, sort of like yourself, sort
Yeah.
of, you know, I mean, where it kind of came to him as a practice, and he was a Buddhist monk at the time when he came up with it, and he was teaching it to people, and then people started to tell him, oh yeah, you know, that's a practice that they practice in Chinese Buddhism, and you know, and other people had kind of come to him, and he was like, oh really?
Oh, really? Yeah, really.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, this kind of practice must be available and done by others. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised, but my I started a kind of contemplative practice in the 70s, early 70s, because I was coming out of the Vietnam War, and I, you know, I felt the need to do that, to just simply go inside and find out something, is what I thought, and I did this through listening, to say a single tone for a long time, and listening. By what I meant by listening was this feeling what happened to me as I did that kind of listening, and then I started to compose what I call sonic meditations in the 70s, and those pieces are pretty well known now. But at the time, it was a real radical departure, because I was experimental musician, and this box set that we have right here, this is about 12 hours of electronic music that I made between 1961 and 1970, and this is why I have people think of me as a pioneer of electronic music. But this box set has only appeared in the last 3 or 4 years now, and a lot of the pieces in there were on the shelf for 40 years. You know, now they're all together and out. So that has been very good. But those pieces I did with equipment that was repurposed from laboratory equipment to be used to make music, but it wasn't intended to make music. But I figured out how to do that, to make a lot of the music that's here. So that's why I was considered a pioneer. There were no synthesizers available. None of the equipment that people take for granted today was used to make this music.
So it really sounds like your deep listening and the music, or your musical background, are really, really entwined.
They are.
And they doesn't even sound like they can be one pulled from the other.
That's true, I think, yeah.
Yeah.
It's very much so, yeah.
So when you do your deep listening, are you always using the bell, or are you sometimes just sitting?
For a class situation, yeah, I use the chime.
But for your own practice?
For my own practice, I'm just doing it.
You're just sitting listening.
Yeah,
in all kinds of environments. And you try to do it continually, just
yes.
kind of always.
Well, it was something like 1953. My mother gave me a tape recorder. A tape recorder was not a usual thing you had in those days, because it was very recent kind of device, you know. And the first thing
was it like one of those big?
It was
reel to reel kind
of.
of things?
Yeah, reel tape recorder. It was about this size, about like that.
Yeah. Not really portable. Portable, but not really portable.
Not really. But I took the microphone and put it in the window and just recorded a full tape of about I think it was a half hour. And I was listening while I was recording, but when I played back the recording, there were sounds on the tape that I hadn't heard. And that was a big challenge to me. And so I said to myself, listen to everything all the time and remind yourself when you're not listening. So that was the real practice.
Wow. How old were you? You said 10?
1953. 52, I was, I must have been 30 years old.
Oh, 30 years old. Oh, so you were already well into being a music composer
Oh, yeah,
person.
right.
Wow. I mean, but don't you feel like just as a musician, that's sort of just your training is to, it's not. I'm not a
I don't
musician,
think
so what do
because,
I know? You know?
Yes, you're taught to listen in certain ways, but the focus often or not, if you're learning an instrument, is on technique. So there are a lot of musicians who have a lot of technique, but they don't listen to what they're playing.
And isn't that sort of the classical difference between a good musician and a really great one? You know, it's like when those musicians can push it, just, you know, really
Yes,
bring
really.
what I'm going to say is soul into the music.
Yes, that's right. But it really takes listening, you know. And listening is not taught. There's something called ear training. But what I'm saying these days is you can't train the ear.
And what is ear training for those of us?
Ear training is learning to recognize patterns, you know, chords and scales and melodies, and to be able to read and sing these melodies and stuff. I used to teach that. I taught it in my own way, and I used to write all of the melodies that were to be sight sung. So I knew that they hadn't seen them before. Anyways, that's all well and good, but it's a system that you're learning, a particular system of Western music, you know. And there's a whole world of music, you know, which is different. And then there is the whole world of nature and the sounds of nature that you can listen to. You can listen to the world as music. You can listen to traffic as music. But not if you're stuck in a system so that you can't recognize anything else as possible.
Earlier you had mentioned that when you're listening, you try not to name what the sounds are.
Right.
Oh, it's a car. Oh, it's a buzzing.
Oh, this is a car.
It's whatever.
Yeah.
And you feel like that's important to the practice?
I do. I think it's important that you be able to experience the sound without having to name it. Yeah.
Why?
Because as soon as you identify a sound and say it is, well, that's a bird, you're no longer listening to it. That's why.
And to really try to bring that in as a pure essence.
Yeah, right. That doesn't mean that I think that naming and categorizing and having taxonomies and so on is not important. It is for many different reasons, but there has to be part of you, at least, that is given to the sensorium that you have, so that you fully experience life, what it is.
Right. And to experience these sounds sort of free of context.
Yeah.
Just
as
sound
for itself. Yes.
Yeah. I've been reading a lot and, you know, going to different types of practices and stuff. And it's really interesting to see sort of the crossovers and the connections of, it's kind of what I've been hearing lately, the way it's been framed is to stop thinking, you know, to really cease that analyzation of what's that sound, what is it I'm seeing, what am I experiencing, but just to experience it as what it is without then putting onto it some other...
Something else.
Yeah.
Boxing it in.
Yeah. And I think that, and I'm curious to hear if you agree with this, but I think that they're, the reason they sort of put this idea forth is to sort of, the feeling is that we're sort of putting on stories or putting on something on the background of everything. And so instead of really experiencing what is really happening, instead we're sort of judging everything and, oh, it's good or it's bad or it's good or it's bad. And so we're sort of ricocheting around instead of just being.
Yeah, just be.
Right, with that thing. And in this case, it would be sound.
Right.
Yeah, do you feel like with the sound, the deep listening, do you feel like you are now more aware of other senses that beyond what you had sort of originally started with the sound?
Well, I think my goal is to expand my consciousness, and I choose to do this through listening and through kinetic awareness, body awareness. At times, I think that I have very heightened visual sensibility, sense. At times, taste, touch, all of the senses that we have, and maybe some senses that we don't have. I don't know.
You tell me.
I don't know for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it would seem to me that when you start on one awareness practice, that it would sort of, influence the rest of your your world. I mean, at least when I was talking about the meditation and how I had, I'm not musical by any.
Why are you making a disclaimer?
Yeah, because so I'm not necessarily drawn that way. I'm much more of a visual person, and so I'm more drawn that way.
Right.
But in being still and silent and being aware in these other realms, I feel like then naturally I wasn't listening behind, I wasn't listening to the vacuum and trying to hear behind the vacuum what was happening. It just happened.
Yes.
Because I was, I guess, so still.
Yes.
Or the environment was so still. Or I was
Because
so crazy bored.
You're doing a little deep listening.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. And that's wonderful.
And it felt miraculous, actually, to hear these things. And I knew, and I was actually hearing songs, not specific songs, but like behind, I don't know, the vacuum, maybe it was country western, and behind the shower it was like blues or whatever. And so it was really like a, like a surprise, It was like a kind of a gift on retreat, where I'm like, oh wow, listen to music.
Listen to this. Okay, yeah. Well, it's taking a walk through the world as music.
Yeah. So do you think that you're going to continue this practice, I guess, right?
Well, I don't see any reason to stop it.
It really has worked for you, it seems like. You really found something that was perfect.
Well, I don't know about perfection, but I know that it's...
Perfect for you.
It's okay for me, yes.
Yeah. And I think that everybody has a little bit different inclinations, like what we're sort of drawn to. And I hope that, this will hit the right people. I mean, I think that you've already had like great success hitting the right people. People are coming to your practices.
Yes.
And really finding you and finding the practice. And so I'm hoping that with the show.
It's spreading, yes.
Yeah.
And we have, we started a certification program so that we have deep listening certificate holders that have fulfilled certain requirements and made presentations and so on, who are out there teaching and doing very, very good job. We have something like 43 certificate holders. We're teaching online right now because the Deep Listening Institute, which was my nonprofit, is now the Center for Deep Listening at Rensselaer. So it's we've dissolved the institute, Deep Listening Institute, and now it's in higher education. So I like to say it came from 14 feet underground to higher education. but the Deep Listening is being incorporated into the curriculum there at RPI, and so it's a nice to know that it is moving into the world in that way. And so this online course that we teach, we have 11 people right now taking that course, and so when they graduate in December, we'll then have 64 deep listening certificate holders.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, we're out of time again, Pauline.
There's plenty more to talk about.
I know. It's not hard to fill a half an hour visit. So thank you so much for coming.